Thank you all for coming out. I have the difficult task of covering 300 years in about a half hour. It ain't gonna happen. Not in a thorough, detailed way, but in a sort of overall understanding and appreciation of what would have taken place. I'll try to do my best. Esteban mentioned the book by William Z. Foster, which is the basic text that I'm using to write, and it's a very thorough history, including a lot of data and statistics. You can see from the Xerox pieces that you've been given, but lots of good data and pieces. Like, who knows that the average slave trader, when they went to Africa, they only paid $50 for a slave, and when they got back, they sold it. They made 1,000% profit in many cases, and it's in the book. Things, just marvelous things that show the inner arguments that went about in the Congress, in the Constitutional Congress, and what in fact in a global and in a historic sense was really taking place with the system of slavery. You know that there was ancient slavery in Rome and Greece, and also the Aztecs had slaves, the Incas had slaves, China was slaves in China. Slaves built the pyramids. They also built the wall on Wall Street, and they built the White House. Slavery has played a huge role in the development of this country and in the world. But ancient slavery was one thing. What we were experiencing in our country and in this hemisphere was modern, what they call modern slavery, which was slavery that came about at a critical time of development of capitalism. And therefore was really a capitalist project. I don't know how to put it. It really was invented and encouraged and built to further the development of capitalism. Not only here, but in England, Scotland, all over Europe, France, Greece, all over Portugal, all over the use of human slavery to foster wealth and to build the fundamentals of the basic economies around the world was a common practice. Usually, this place was a colony of England, and usually, when they would settle an area, they would force the indigenous people to serve as their labor. So Australia was the Aborigines, and here it was the Native American Indians. But they couldn't do it with the Native American Indians. This was their land. They were not inclined to be stationed in some plantation, picking cotton or whatever. They were in a hunting and gathering stage, many of them, and they just didn't fit. So the policy of the Indians became what?
Genocide.
Genocide.
Yeah.
And what they did to the Indians was another crime against humanity, including spreading disease among them, hunting them down, murdering and destroying whole tribal groups, leaving them without the land that they owned, that was their land. But they did try to enslave some at first, and it didn't work, as I said. But that meant that the Native American Indians not only didn't like these people who had come and settled and wanted to enslave them, they were ready to do war with them. And the African slaves who came were able to get away from slavery because of the Native American Indians offered them a place. The Maroons, they call them. Some they intermarried in some cases, and that's how they got all over this hemisphere. From the first presence of slaves, African slaves on this continent, in this country, was in 1526. That's before Columbus and all that. Portuguese were way ahead of everybody in getting involved in international slave trade. This was the Spanish, rather, in this case, explorer Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón, who, with a group of white settlers, settled in and tried to set up a colony at the mouth of the PD River in South Carolina. Well, the Africans who had been dragged there forcibly and so forth, first chance they got, they rebelled and ran away. So much for his little colony. And because they didn't have people they could exploit and labor, these Spanish explorers got back in their boat and left. But they left the Africans here. So actually, there were actually Africans on this, in this part of the world, way before Columbus and all that. In fact, in 1526, that would make them 100 years before the settlement of Virginia, the Virginia colony. So when people say, well, you guys are latecomers coming to this country, and when you get the hang of it, everything will be all right. You got to figure out how, that whole thing about, well, the Italians came in, they did well, these ones came in, did well, and so forth. So you'll do okay after a while. But we were here before almost anybody. We ain't doing well. Well, I think that's related to an attempt to hide the structural racism and oppression that was visited upon us as a people, which held us back, not ourselves. It wasn't our fault, not us. It was the oppressor. Moving along. From the 16th to the 19th century, over 12 million Africans were kidnapped and forcibly brought here to the Western Hemisphere to face a lifetime of cruel slavery. Of those 12 million, most ended up in English colonies and other colonies, Dutch colonies, so forth, in the Caribbean and Central and South America. About 680,000 ended up here in the 13 colonies. By 1860, which was a year before the beginning of the Civil War, on the eve of it, the slave population had grown to 4 million. Was that 680,000 reproduced and were actually bred in many cases. And out of a total population of 31 million, 4 million were African slaves. They were more than 10% of the population then. Marx said that capitalism came on the scene dripping with blood. And modern slavery, that certainly describes what it was. It was a capitalist creation, as I said. The Western Hemisphere colonies were fertile land. This country was fertile land. And the main production in this economy was agriculture. So you needed a workforce. I mentioned about the Native American Indians. But did you know that there was the import of large numbers of white slaves from Europe? They called them indentured servants, though, because when they came, first of all, where did they come from? Many of them were people who had been arrested or whatever, either framed up, we don't even know, put in prison and said, okay, you can either spend 6 years in this harbor prison or go to the colony and work your way out. And after you go there for a period of time, you will be free to go forward, but you won't get paid. You just have to be, you'll be a worker, you'll get a job, and you'll have to be a slave. And large numbers of whites from Europe were forced into that situation. And some weren't criminals at all. They just happened to be out in the street at night. And then literally, they had bands of thugs who went around, whacked them in the head, or got them drunk, and they woke up and they were at sea. What's this? They didn't know where they were going, they didn't know what was going on or whatever, and they ended up and they got off the boat, you were indentured servant, and they had to work several years. some as much as 6 years on usually agricultural work. And at the end of it, in some states, like in Virginia, for example, they had a rule. When you finish, you get not only a piece of land, but you get a plow and the workings to start your own. These folks, a lot of them were the beginning of our white working class, or working class at the early stage. And so when the first Africans came, not all of them, but some of them were also made indentured servants. And so I always wondered, okay, we had slavery, but in history there's all these freed people. Who are they? And they were essentially people who may have come early and been and had that indentured thing, got that land and started something. And in fact, grew and became a large group of people, although they were more slaves than freed blacks. Well, those freed people became a problem for the slaveholders. Why? Because when they would get themselves settled, get a family, raise children, they set up their own schools. Some of them became successful farmers, you know, and relatives. Some they even come with at the time they called rich. They still faced discrimination and racism. They were not equal, but they, in fact, had a chance to work hard and achieve something and to get a standing in society. They started newspapers. They formed their own churches. They had all kinds of civic organizations and stuff. And the main thing, though, is that they became an organized voice against slavery itself, but they obviously could do what the slaves couldn't do. And so the slave owners said, wait a minute, we are creating our own downfall here. And they passed laws in key states. Virginia is one of them. And in 1661, the Assembly of the colony passed a law continuing indentured servitude for whites, but that black slaves would be slaves for life. And that became the rule, dripping with blood. Why did this horrible system, the Middle Passage, where, you know, the slave was given a 6 foot by long or 2 foot wide slab to sleep on in the bottom. And you know, you might think, well, maybe they had 30 slaves. Hundreds of slaves were in some of those ships. They weren't the biggest ships either, but they packed them in. And no sanitation. Anybody know how long the trip was back then to come across the Atlantic?
3 months?
No, not that long. But
well, it depends on the,
in the book,
depends on the weather.
say it again?
It depends on the weather, but
Yeah.
It contributed to
Could
our
be maybe from 3 to 6 weeks. And not only that, it wasn't just the weather. I mean, some of the ships didn't make it because of the storms they run through. They didn't have radar. They didn't, you know, they were just coming. But on top of that, there were also pirates who would attack these ships, and you know, mechanical problems, all kinds of stuff. But most of them made it. But you know, it was a tough thing. But that wasn't true about the Africans. When they got sick on that boat, they were thrown overboard, and they got sick. Dysentery. There was this eye disease once at Foster mentions that everybody on the boat got, including the crew. They were actually flying guiding the boat blind. That nobody could see. But after some days, you got your sight back. I forget what the disease is. It's probably still around. And yeah, that's what's in the book. Yeah. Well, you were pronouncing. I was scared too. Those who didn't make it, thrown overboard. Obviously, with no sanitation, they said you could smell a slave ship coming for miles. And on top of that, if they ever, especially after slavery was ruled, slave trade was ruled illegal, and they had the Navy was patrolling the seas. If they saw a Navy ship coming, all of them went overboard. Slave ships would attract sharks. Literally, whole herds of sharks would follow them. And unfortunately, a lot of the people were thrown overboard. Men, women, children. Some of the women were pregnant on this thing. You know, I don't want to like shock nobody, but can you imagine the inhumanity to do that to somebody? And I say, were they evil white folks? I mean, yeah, they were evil, but it was deeper than that. They were driven by the drive for profit and by what they defined as the development of the Western world. This is coming about at times when you had early industry, commerce, and so forth. And this is an era, we're moving towards an era where the transition is being made from old feudal and semi-feudal systems to a capitalist system. And the wealth of slavery served as the foundation, the economic foundation to build for this country and actually for much of Europe. Industrial and commercial, really giant and powerful countries like the one we live in. These people were racist, there's no question about it, but they were also capitalists that created what was the most brutal, violent, barbaric system of racial oppression in modern times. Perhaps even ever, because if you remember the David Walker appeal, David Walker wrote a piece on comparing ancient slavery to modern slavery. And in it, after his study, he showed that modern slavery, ancient slavery, the slaves could actually get married. Maybe not everywhere, but generally, they could get married. After a period of time, they may have to get permission. In fact, indentured servants who came had to get permission to get married, but they could get married, but not the Africans. They could get married, they could have children, they could have families, and they could work their way out of slavery. It wasn't a lifetime sentence. It was okay for them to learn to read and write. They didn't have an easy life. Don't get me wrong. They were slaves and they were brutalized and so forth. I always think of that movie Gladiator, but there's some truth to that. I mean, they were actually enslaved to go out and fight and get killed. You know, what kind of life is that? But you know, in ancient Greece and Rome, some of the most brilliant people were slaves. They were the poets and philosophers. So they were allowed to learn and read and write and so forth. But what about here? And this is, I think, has a lot to do with this slavery forged on to capitalism. And I'll tell you why. The slaves here could not learn to read and write. Illegal. Now some did. But it was illegal for them to learn to read or write. They could not marry. They couldn't have a family. Now, some did, but the law was that they're not supposed to. They had no parental rights on their children. The whole concept of being sold down the river actually is a saying that came from them really taking children and families and breaking them up and sending them down the river to be sold to somebody else. That's where that phrase came from. They had no health care really, so among them there were those who were midwives and they could do things and so forth. But, and I was down at the Smithsonian Institute and they had this whole display on slavery. If you ever get a chance, you should go down and see it, because it's in the words of the slaves. Also in the 1930s during the WPA, there was a project that went around and interviewed. There was still some left, people who had lived through slavery, and they have their discussion of what life was really like. So it's not a mystery. We know what it was like. And I was struck by this phrase that one slave said. He said, "I work 7 days a week. From you can see to you can't see." That's what he described. In the morning when the sun just come up until it was dark, you work through all kinds of weather. And they got snow down there too. I don't know what you do in the snow, but they work all kinds of weather, the rain or whatever. The children work, the women work while they were pregnant, some of them delivered right out, you know. It's just the stark evilness and so forth of it so much. But I always say this, we, all of us, to one degree or another, are related, or had some relationship to that 12 million that made it over. And those African American people, African descent, who have roots that go all the way back to that, and all of us pretty much do. Whoever our ancestors were, they were tough. They were incredible because they survived what you ain't supposed to survive. There's some sense of pride that we were able to fight it through and be here. And then they said that labor for a field hand was only about 7 or 8 years that you could do really hard field work. That's how bad it was. And I don't know how they managed to survive, but they did. They had spirit. They had a fighting spirit. They had their religion. You see, the slave religion, even though the master gave them Christianity, here you can have that, behave yourself, this is what you ought to listen to. But that their concept of Christianity and their concept of religion was one of rebellion, fighting. More like what, Martin Luther King's concept of religion. And so, Nat Turner, this great militant anti-slavery fighter, he led a huge rebellion. But it failed. But he was a minister. He would teach, he would preach every morning. The spirituals, swing low, sweet chariot, and coming for to carry you home, signal. And they're telling people how to hide and duck them when they escape, which so many did. But dripping with blood. And the profits made from slavery were dripping with blood. I mentioned that in 18th century, slaves from Africa, in Africa, cost $50. When they got to the West Indies, they could get anywhere from 400 or whatever for them. One captain, this in the book, said that even if he lost 2 out of 3 of slaves coming over, he said he'd still be a rich man when he got here. That's what this thing was worth. I went to Glasgow, Scotland last year, and I did the same kind of talking. I did all over the United Kingdom. I went all over England and up to Scotland, Wales, and made a speech, and pretty much covered this kind of stuff. And in Scotland, one guy came up to me after and said, we have a museum on slavery, anti-slavery movement in this area. I said, wow, that's great. And he took me up there and showed me, he had a lot of good stuff. They put out a little magazine on ethnicity up there in Glasgow. And he said the richest family in Scotland is called the Cunninghams. And he said, I want you to come outside and look. And I'm coming outside. He said, see that house way up there? It's not even a house, it's like a castle. It's now the museum of Glasgow. It was the house of the Cunninghams. Everything up there is named Cunningham. They made their money on slavery. When Frederick Douglass came into Glasgow, I'm walking down the street and I see the street, Frederick Douglass Avenue. Whoa, in Scotland, in Glasgow. And they said he made one of the greatest speeches right out here on this square to thousands of workers about what slavery meant. And his main thesis was that slavery was against the U.S. Constitution, which have all these wonderful things about human rights and freedom and all that. And he argued that, and that was not accepted by the establishment. But Frederick Douglass made that speech there. He also made it other places. He made it there. And I went down to a place called Newcastle. Coals to Newcastle. It's a coal town. And right near there's a place called Tynes, something on Tynes. And I figured that's close to my name. It's probably where our slave master came from. It's T-Y-N-E. I'm T-Y-N-E-R, so I'm figuring out, that's where it came from. The lady who paid for Frederick Douglass's slave, to get him out of slavery, lived in that place, that town. A Scottish woman who was moved by his speaking and was moved by the struggle against it, so on. The whole world was turned against slavery. The British ended slave trade earlier. Slavery was outlawed in Mexico. And you should know that nobody hardly talks about it, but Gerald Horne wrote a book about it, about how many slaves, when they escaped, they didn't try to go all the way north. They went south. They went to Mexico, you know, where slavery was eliminated. And at one point, one president of Mexico, this was a little further along in history, invited African Americans to come down there and form a colony. There's an area in Mexico which is predominantly black. I don't know a lot about it, but I'm told that it was in that book anyway. I mentioned that right here in New York City, the slaves built the Wall Street. They built a lot of the famous structures around here. When they built that, they were building a building down on Wall Street, a big bank building or something, one of those 30-story things. And when they went to dig to excavate, they discovered all these bones. And they were actually, the old building that was there was sitting on top of a slave graveyard. You all know that story here in New York, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, but the anthropologists and geologists stopped them from going further. They collected all the bones and they studied them. And they, see, these were not agricultural slaves. These were just hard labor slaves. And they discovered all kinds of injuries that people were suffering because they were carrying heavy weights, including children. They found a skeleton of a 14-year-old child whose bones were all screwed up, all distorted because he was some kind of a pack mule. They were putting stuff on him to carry it and so forth. Am I getting too graphic with this stuff? I think we shouldn't let them forget this stuff. I don't know. And after the invention of the cotton gin, which in Apthecker's book he writes that the cotton gin was actually invented in a crude form. The first drawing was by a highly skilled slave did the first drawing of it. But Eli, what's his name?
Whitney, right? Whitney. Yeah.
Was it?
Eli Whitney?
Whitney, yes.
Yeah.
Eli Whitney, in fact, took it and developed a sophisticated thing. Now, the cotton gin, actually slavery was kind of waning, some people say. I don't know if that's true or not. They were. Some people say that, the historians. But when they found, it was living on tobacco, indigo, sugar from the Caribbean, and some degree cotton, and what all the good stuff. The world wanted, and this is a very fertile area of the world, and so forth. But when they were able to separate the ball from the stem of cotton, and therefore made it possible to produce a huge quantity of cotton, it was such a comfortable and wonderful fabric. The whole world wanted cotton. And so cotton became king. And once cotton became king, the slave owners were just raking in the dough. They were just pouring in the money. And as far as they were concerned, as much land as they could get their whole hands on and plant cotton, the more it was unlimited. They actually had a plan, or pushed the plan, that they wanted from the southeast all the way over to the Pacific, which were mostly territories then, to be a slave state. And that's west. But going south, they wanted to go all the way down to Brazil, where there was slaves down there, but to do cotton all the way around there. That's the nightmare that they came up with in order to further their wealth and power and so forth. Well, in time, people questioned the moral issue of slavery. It was immoral. How could you treat human beings that way? You can imagine. Some churches went completely with it. In fact, there's some stories in the book about sections of the church that accommodated to slavery. First they said, no, it's against, we shouldn't do it, it's against our preaching, teaching, but then they accommodated to slavery. And great institutions, like the Ivy League College, the money for the Ivy League colleges, students have since created a movement around it. Brown University, Harvard, Yale, all that money that they used to build those colleges came from slavery. And so the students were raising big protests, and then the demand for reparations came up and so forth, and it remains an agitational point, I think. But when people questioned the morality of it, they argued, well, you can't say that we're mistreating them. They're not like regular people. They're not like us. They're not people. In fact, in the highest universities in this country, they taught the Teutonic theories, which were essentially only those of Germanic, European, sort of Nordic kind of background have the capacity to think on a high level and to rule this world, and they should. Other people who don't have that should not be considered equal to them. They taught that in the universities. Now, obviously, some people didn't go for it and challenged it. And among regular common people, like John Brown and other, in the abolition movement, and so forth, they gave their life, they dedicated their life to the overthrow of slavery. They saw its moral bankruptcy. They also saw that slavery was holding back the development of this country, which brings me to the northern capitalists, who saw that we were an agricultural country, but we were moving towards an industrial and commercial country, and that the system of labor that's based on slavery was not suitable for that. And on top of that, they needed a national economy to be able to successfully exploit the riches of this nation and build their wealth up and so on. And the slave companies, the slave owners wanted to move to the West and all that, and they, on the other hand, wanted slavery to not spread. And there's another thing about cotton production. After, I think it's 2 cycles, it destroys the land. It takes the land a long time to recover. So they have to keep spreading in order to get fruitful crops. So so spreading became their bread and butter. On the other hand, the northern capitalists were raising industrialists, really. They both were capitalists, believe me. The plantation owners were capitalists. The northern industrialists were arguing, you are really slowing down the process of development. And you know that there's some controversy about the Revolutionary War, and we hear about Christmas Adams. But the pain and anger and hurt of 100 years or more of slavery, when the slaves heard that the British had ended slavery and were coming in here to stop the American Revolution from happening, even though in terms of the sweep of history, ending colonialism was a good thing. But the fighters, but the early so-called founding fathers all had slaves, and they were not willing to challenge the system of slavery and make it a part of making this an independent nation and getting rid of colonialism. So the British took advantage of that. And they told the slaves, if you leave your plantation and come to us, we will liberate you. And some did. In some states, thousands of slaves left their plantation and ran to the British lines. I think some fought with the British. Gerald has sent me a little controversial thing about it recently, Gerald Horn, the guy right there, about how the British had abandoned slavery, the slave trade, and it was the American colonists fighting for equality, fighting for independence, that in fact were defending slavery. But I think what it was in the main was the Southern slaveholders did not want to end that system. And it's also a fact that 5,000 people of African descent. First, they only allowed freed blacks to join the revolutionary armies, which was a kind of ragtag, people's army. Although the people running the thing were merchants and wealthy people on both sides, actually. And 5,000 people of African descent participated in the independent army, in the independent struggle. And many of them served with great distinction. as they did in the Civil War. And there were some interesting cases of heroism, which, as I say, it's in the book. I was struck by one story about a woman named Deborah Chatham, I think her name was, Deborah Garnett, I'm sorry, yeah, Garnett, like the guy who plays for Brooklyn. Deborah Garnett, who fought with distinction with the Revolutionary Army, was a great fighter, all the while she was disguised as a man. They didn't know she was a man. And turns out she was, after I said she was of African descent, black woman did that. Very interesting. But the Revolutionary War, despite these contradictions, stirred up a lot of the spirit of liberty in the country. And all these great words, you know, we the people, and what's that famous one? All men are created equal. All of those slogans were imbued on everybody's mind and talking about it, and here we had slavery. Here we had slavery. What a disgrace. But people were pushing, including some of the so-called early fathers of this nation, as they call them. Ben Franklin, Alexander Hamilton. Both of them belonged to the Anti-Slavery Society eventually. And Benjamin Franklin actually argued that slave labor was more expensive as compared to free wage labor, and he showed that slavery was a barrier to the growth of manufacturing, which is where things were heading towards. He also challenged the theory that Negroes were mentally inferior to whites. This is in this book too. And of course, in 1959, slavery still waging. We're heading for the Civil War. The battle in Congress between the North and the South, particularly about the spread of slavery, is fierce. In fact, you heard of the Missouri Compromise. I'm going to end in a minute. The Missouri Compromise, where there was this long fight, about 3 years, they were arguing about what to do about Missouri. Obviously, Missouri was the key to them going to the West. And the Northern capitalists and the people didn't want them to spread slavery. And so they were against this. So they argued and argued, and the final solution was they could go so far into Missouri. One part would be have slavery, and the other part would not have slavery, be a non-slave state. But the southern plantation owners had dollar signs in their eye, you know, or whatever the currency. And when they lost these battles in the Congress, that's when they started succeeding from the Union. And as a result, the split was gone. And the arguments that were taking place in the Congress, in the Revolutionary Constitutional Congress, were now about to go into a real war. So, in 1861, the South, in a very unscrupulous way, war is unscrupulous, decided to fire on Fort Sumter, and there was a sneak attack, and they basically declared war. It was really an armed attempt to overthrow the new republic. It was a counter-revolution from the fight of the revolution. And it's kind of what's interesting. They always accuse the left of doing stuff like this, you know. And really the truth is that the coup people, the people who do this stuff throughout history, have been the most reactionary elements. And these southern planters were that. Well, I'm almost done. I want to mention the spirit of John Brown. In 1859, John Brown and a band of, I think it's about 15 of them, went into Harper's Ferry in Virginia, which is now West Virginia, I think, and took over the armory in this town, and actually took over the town for a period of time. And their plan was to start a rebellion. By the way, they had slaves in their rights, and they had his family, his sons, and really mainly farmers, you know, from Kansas, I think they came from, where they had big fights against the slaveholders. And they were now going to take over, and they were hoping that their action would cause a spontaneous rebellion among the slaves, who in some places outnumbered the farmers, the owners. And it was a noble idea. But as Frederick Douglass, who's a good friend of John Brown, he spoke of going to visit John Brown in his house, and he said John Brown was truly a decent man, and I'm paraphrasing, he said, I detected not 1 ounce of racial hostility or ignorance among them. I put my feet under his table, I was at home, as that's what Frederick Douglass said. But he also said that John Brown, he had heard about this thing, what was going to happen. He told John Brown that it's very courageous, but it's not going to win. He said it's not going to win. It's premature. It's not going to win. Well, they sent the National Guard in. They stood off, tried to hold them off for a while. And I actually went to Harper's Ferry. If you ever get a chance to go by, it's not far from D.C. It's amazing. It's like a federal park. And the library is full of left-wing literature. I don't know if they know it or not. On John Brown, on slave, on Du Bois, they got all this stuff in there. And it's cheap. But if you go there, you get this sense, it's just this little place. And this little barn where they defended themselves. And by the way, 2 of them escaped, including one guy, an African-American guy. He took off. He got up the mountain, got away. Another one got away. They went to Canada. But others were killed, and John Brown was seriously wounded, you know. Eventually, he was hung, and a whole bunch of others were hung. And it was a defeat. But was it? Because 2 years later, thousands of soldiers marched from the north to the south. What were they singing? John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, but his truth keeps marching on. And in a sense, that act of martyrdom on his part. And by the way, there's this beautiful scene where he's on his way to the gallows, and he's walking by, and there's this African-American woman with a child, and asked him, would you kiss my child? Okay, you know, and he did. And it's this beautiful moment. In the literature, it's very moving. And then he walks. They're hanging. But the people, the slaves, they wanted something to happen, and it did, but it was not ready. But 2 years later, the Civil War kicked off. It was the longest and bloodiest war in our history, but ultimately it was defeated. And Karl Marx had a debate with Frederick Engels. Karl Marx, whose view was that, in this famous quote, capital, labor in the white skin can never be free as long as labor in the black skin is branded. That was his take on what was going on in the United States. And by the way, branded is exactly what they did. When they got to the West Indies, the first thing they did was put a hot iron on them to establish their ownership. But he said, and he wrote for the New York, I think it was called the Herald something. He wrote regular column. Huh?
Herald Tribune.
It was the Herald Tribune, okay. He wrote a wonderful column analyzing the Civil War, and he did it from England. He also, and he had a debate going with Engels, and his debate with Engels said that the South, you know, the South and the North, the generals and the high-ranking people, they all went to West Point. They knew each other. So, and he said the South had been more prepared for this war. They struck first. They are militarily superior to the North. The North is going to lose. And Marx said, my dear friend, you are wrong. The North is going to win because they got history on their side. That stuff is going to die. Meantime, Marx spent his time on the docks of Liverpool and London defending, organizing the workers not to accept goods from the slave-holding South, which is where they made a lot of their money going into England and so forth. Mm-hmm. And he organized his workers, what was it called? Workers, it was a workers' organization. I'm sorry. But That was the father of Marxism and of our party and communism and so forth. And that is a great, great tradition that in that period of great turmoil and difficulties that he stood on the right side of history. And that's what we do. Okay.
Thank you, Jarvis. Great report. So I know we have we wanted to open it up to some questions and answers, but I mean some questions and discussion. But I don't know if people want to grab like something to drink, or I could bring the soda over here because I think we're kind of crunched for time. So if anybody wants something to drink, I can go grab it, like the soda and stuff. But let's open up the floor if anyone have any questions or something like that. Frank, go ahead.
I got a question. You know, I knew
Before
that.
we go ahead, we never went around the room.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
Oh,
You would say who they are and what they're doing.
Okay, good. All right. So I guess when you want to start, you can start then. Go ahead.
so just for everybody, in case you didn't hear, why don't you say what Danny said? I don't know.
So we're gonna announce. Hello. So everybody's gonna say, kind of what your name is, how you ended up coming here today, that sort of thing. So I guess James, go first, man. Didn't seem like you want to start.
I'm James. Been here for